Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to explore complex ideas, pull out the really key insights, and bring them straight to you, our listeners. And today, we're taking a journey deep into the workings of your own mind, actually. So let's maybe start with a quick thought experiment. Imagine someone describes a guy named Steve, okay? He's very shy, withdrawn, super helpful, but honestly not that interested in people or the real world. He's described as a meek, tidy soul, needs order, structure, loves detail. Now, just based on that, what's your gut feeling? Is Steve more likely a librarian or a farmer? If you're like most people, librarian probably jumps out, right? It just fits. But here's the kicker. Statistically, in the U.S., there are way more male farmers than male librarians, like over 20 to 1. So the odds are much, much higher that Steve's actually a farmer, despite that description. Our intuition, well, that often just ignores the raw numbers.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, how strong that immediate feeling is, even when the statistics, point the other way entirely. It tells us something really fundamental about how our minds work, and crucially, how they can sometimes lead us down predictable wrong paths.
Exactly. And that's really our mission for this deep dive. We want to unpack these kinds of surprising patterns in how we judge things, how we make decisions, these cognitive biases. We're drawing heavily on Daniel Kahneman's incredible book, Thinking Fast and Slow. The aim here is to give you a better vocabulary, really, to understand these common errors in thinking, hopefully helping you become, better informed and make sharper choices day to day and in the big stuff.
And the core idea, the sort of central metaphor Kahneman uses, is that your mind has these two distinct ways of operating, almost like two characters in your head. There's system one, fast, automatic, intuitive, runs on gut feelings. And then there's system two, slower, much more effortful, the deliberate part of your thinking.
Okay, so let's unpack this idea. Two systems, because they're pretty much always running, right? Yeah. System one, you called it the automatic pilot. It's working constantly, effortlessly, generating impressions, feelings, little nudges. It's how you instantly know what a doggy is, or how a chess grandmaster can just see the board, the patterns, the good moves, almost instantly. Like intuition is just recognition.
Exactly. Herbert Simon, who studied chess masters, put it perfectly. Intuition is nothing more and nothing less than recognition. That's system one. Quick pattern matching based on loads of experience. But its power, and sometimes its problem, is that it runs on its own. Like, think about the Muller-Lyer illusion.
Oh, yeah, the lines with the fins.
Right, those two lines. Even when you measure them, you know they're the same length. Your system one still sees one as longer. It just keeps churning out that impression, regardless of what you consciously believe. It can't really be turned off.
That's kind of wild, isn't it? That persistence. Like, it's operating on a totally different level from our rational thought. Meanwhile, system two. That's the deliberate thinker, the conscious you, the part that feels like you choosing, concentrating, figuring things out.
Right. It's the heavy lifter. It does the hard mental work, like calculating 17 times 24.
Ugh, don't make me do that now.
No, exactly. Or holding, say, a string of numbers in your head while doing something else to them, like the add 3 task Kahneman mentions. And these system 2 tasks, they literally make your pupils dilate. It's a physical sign of mental effort.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's a direct trade-off. Try walking really fast and thinking through a complex problem at the same time. It's hard. It seems like self-control and deliberate thought pull from the same limited energy source, the same sort of mental budget.
Which leads us to this almost funny idea Kahneman talks about, the law of least effort. Basically, we're kind of wired for laziness.
It seems so. We naturally drift towards the easiest path mentally and physically. Laziness is, as he puts it, built deep into our nature.
So system two, the effortful one, can actually be, well, lazy.
Precisely. That's a key point. System 2 often just defaults to accepting whatever System 1 suggests without really double-checking. Think about that classic bat and ball problem. A bat and ball costs $1.10 total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much is the ball?
Oh, I know this one. The immediate answer is 10 cents, right?
That's what System 1 shouts out. It feels right, it's easy, but it's wrong.
Right, because if the ball is 10 cents, the bat is $1.10, and the total is $1.20. The ball has to be 5 cents.
Exactly. The bat is $1.05. Total, $1.10. But getting to 5 cents requires engaging System 2, doing the actual math, overriding that instant intuitive answer.
It's such a simple puzzle, but it shows it perfectly. System 1 just leaps.
And Kahneman argues that getting these wrong isn't necessarily about low intelligence. It's more about insufficient motivation or maybe intellectual sloth, just being too quick to accept the easy answer without putting in the mental work to verify it.
So it's not just about being smart, it's about being willing to think hard.
pretty much. The cognitive reflection test, which uses problems like that, finds that people who score low tend to be more impulsive. They just go with system one. Higher scorers are more reflective, more willing to question those gut feelings, more engaged mentally. They use their system two more actively.
So the takeaway is raw intelligence isn't enough. You need that willingness to engage the lazy controller, system two. Okay, so system one is always on, generating stuff. Where do the predictable mistakes, the biases come in? What's a really basic way it trips us up?
Well, a fundamental one is this idea of cognitive ease. Basically, when something feels easy to process, fluent, system one links that ease with good feelings and, crucially, with truth. If it feels easy, it feels right, it feels familiar, it feels true.
It's amazing how subtle that can be. So anything that makes processing smoother can actually bias our beliefs?
Exactly. Take repetition. Kahneman highlights research showing that just repeating a statement, even a false one, makes people more likely to believe it. In one study, just hearing the phrase, the body temperature of a chicken multiple times, made people more likely to accept a completely made-up fact, like the body temperature of a chicken is 144 degrees.
Wow. Just because the phrase itself became familiar.
Yes, familiarity breeds a sense of truth. System one doesn't easily distinguish between them. The takeaway is, be a bit skeptical of things that feel true simply because you've heard them a lot.
Okay. And it's not just repetition, right?
No, other things too. Aphorisms seem wiser if they rhyme. People actually trusted reports more from companies with easy-to-pronounce names, like R10 versus, say, Tahat.
Seriously, just the name.
Apparently so.
Yeah.
Because processing Tahat takes a tiny bit more mental effort, and effort feels slightly negative. System 2 just prefers the easier option.
Okay, that's subtle.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned system one works through associative activation. What does that mean?
It means that ideas, memories, concepts are all linked together in a vast network in your mind. And activating one node, say, by seeing a word, automatically triggers related nodes, like ripples spreading out. And this can happen completely unconsciously, even influencing your behavior.
Like that famous experiment with the elderly words.
Exactly. The John Bargh study. Students unscrambled sentences containing words linked to old age Florida, wrinkle, forgetful, that sort of thing. Afterwards, without realizing it, they walked significantly slower down the hallway compared to a control group. The words primed the concept of old, which then primed the action of slow walking.
That's incredible. So our actions can be shaped by things we aren't even aware of processing.
It really seems so. The big takeaway is that you're often influenced by your environment, by these subtle primes, way more than you think. You're not always the sole author of your actions and feelings.
We even saw that in that kitchen study, right? With the eyes versus flowers poster.
Yes. Just putting up a poster with eyes looking out nearly tripled the amount people paid into the coffee fund compared to a flower poster week. That purely symbolic reminder of being watched nudged people towards better, more cooperative behavior, all unconsciously.
Okay, so priming is one thing. What about the halo effect?
The halo effect. This is our tendency to let our overall impression of a person or maybe a company or a product color our judgment of their specific traits. So if you generally like a politician, you're probably also going to think they have a nice voice and are trustworthy, even if you have no specific evidence for those things.
It's like system one wants everything to fit neatly. Good things go with good things, bad with bad.
Precisely. It creates what Kahneman calls exaggerated emotional coherence, makes the world feel simpler, more consistent than it really is. Bad traits don't easily fit with good impressions.
And this connects to that acronym, WYSIAD.
WYSIAD. What you see is all there is. It's a crucial concept. System 1 builds the best, most coherent story it can, using only the information that's currently activated or available. It doesn't pause to ask, wait, what information am I missing? It just jumps to conclusions based on what it does see.
Like the example, Mindick seems smart and strong. Will she be a good leader? System 1 immediately says yes.
Right. It constructs a positive story. It doesn't consider that the next two words might be corrupt and cruel because that information isn't available yet. So the insight for you is that your mind prioritizes a coherent story over a complete one. Be aware that your initial judgments are often based on incomplete data.
So practically, how do we fight this? Kahneman mentioned how he graded exams.
Yeah, it's a great practical tip. Instead of grading one student's entire booklet, he'd grade all the answers to question 1, then all the answers to question 2, and so on. This stopped his initial impression of a student on question 1 from creating a halo effect that biased his grading of later questions.
Makes sense.
And for meetings, he suggests a similar discipline. Have everyone write down their brief opinion before the discussion starts. That way, the first or most confident speaker doesn't dominate everyone else's thinking through the halo effect. The takeaway: structure your information gathering to minimize these coherence biases.
Super useful. Okay, let's shift to judging probability. System 1 uses shortcuts, heuristics. We mentioned representativeness with Steve the librarian, judging by stereotype.
Exactly. Steve seems like a librarian, so we ignore the base rate, the actual number of librarians versus farmers. The Tom W. problem is another classic example. People ranked potential college majors for Tom based purely on how well his personality sketch matched the stereotype for each field. They completely ignore the actual enrollment numbers, like there are vastly more humanities students than, say, library science students. But if Tom sounded like a librarian...
And it trumped the numbers.
Right. And interestingly, System 1 is better at using base rates if they feel causal. Like 85% of cab accidents in the city involve green cabs because their drivers are reckless. That's easier to grasp than just 85% of cabs are green.
Ah, because it tells a story.
Exactly. System 1 loves a good story, a causal explanation, much more than plain statistics.
Okay, representativeness is one. What's the other big one? Availability.
The availability heuristic, judging how frequent or probable something is based on how easily examples spring to mind.
Like the classic spouse's example, overestimating how much housework you do.
Perfect example. You remember your efforts taking out the trash much more easily and vividly than you remember your partner's efforts, so you overestimate your contribution. It's more available in your memory.
Guilty as charged.
We all are. And it affects bigger judgments, too. Think about causes of death. Media coverage massively skews this. Dramatic, unusual events, shark attacks, terrorism, rare diseases get tons of coverage. They become highly available in our minds. So we overestimate their frequency compared to more common but less dramatic causes like strokes or diabetes.
So the vividness, the emotional punch, makes it stick.
Yes. And this can lead to what Kahneman calls availability cascades, where a media story fuels public panic, which leads to more media coverage, which fuels more panic. This can distort public policy, leading us to focus resources on managing minor risks that feel scary while ignoring larger, less available ones. Love canal is a good example of concerns snowballing way beyond the statistical risk.
The takeaway there feels like question your gut feelings about risk, especially if they're fueled by recent vivid news stories. Look for the actual data.
Absolutely crucial.
Okay, one more bias from this section. Anchoring. What's that about?
Anchoring is when an initial number, even a totally random one, influences your subsequent estimates. Your final guess stays closer to that anchor than it otherwise would.
Like the Wheel of Fortune experiment.
Precisely. People spun a wheel that landed on a random number, say 10 or 65. Then they were asked to estimate the percentage of African nations in the UN. Even though they knew the wheel number was random, the people who got 10 gave much lower estimates, median 25%, than those who got 65. Median 45%.
Just from seeing that irrelevant number first.
Yes. The adjustment away from the anchor is almost always insufficient.
How does that even work?
The theory is that the anchor selectively primes compatible thoughts. If I anchor you with a high number for Gandhi's age at death, say 114 years.
I start thinking about really old age.
Exactly. Whereas if I anchor you low, say 35, you access different thoughts. The anchor brings related ideas to mind, biasing your estimate.
So this affects things like negotiation, right? The first offer sets an anchor.
Absolutely. Listing prices for houses, salary negotiations. Anchors are everywhere, subtly influencing our judgments without us even realizing it. The key insight: be aware of potential anchors, question if they're relevant, and try consciously to adjust away from them more than your intuition suggests. #TechTimer33. Flaws in our forecasting and understanding.
Okay, so we have these biases, but Kahneman also points out more fundamental flaws in how we understand things, especially cause and effect, and how we predict the future. Let's start with the law of small numbers.
Right. This is basically our tendency to believe that small samples reflect the underlying population much more reliably than they actually do. We expect patterns to emerge too quickly. Kahneman even mentions how researchers, psychologists included, often use sample sizes so small they had a huge risk, like 50-50, of failing to find real effects just due to random variation. They had too much faith in small samples.
Like the small schools example. Finding high-achieving schools were often small.
Yes. The Gates Foundation saw this pattern, and the intuitive story jumped out. Smaller schools mean more attention, better results. Makes sense, right?
Seems plausible.
But if they'd looked, they would have found that the worst performing schools also tended to be small.
Oh.
The real reason is just statistics. Outcomes in small samples are much more variable, more prone to extremes, both good and bad than in large samples. Smallness itself wasn't the cause of high achievement.
That's a massive insight. Don't mistake random variation in small groups for a meaningful pattern.
Exactly. Which leads nicely into the next big one. Regression to the mean.
This one always feels tricky. It's the idea that extreme results tend to be followed by more average ones, just by chance.
That's the core of it, and it constantly fools us. The classic story is the Israeli flight instructors. They observed that when they praised a pilot for an exceptionally great landing, the next landing was usually worse. But when they yelled at a pilot for a terrible landing, the next one was usually better.
So they concluded, punishment works, praise doesn't.
That's what they thought. But they were wrong. It was just regression to the mean. An unusually good landing has luck involved. The next one is likely to be closer to their average. An unusually bad landing also involves bad luck. The next one is likely closer to average too.
So the feedback, the praise or criticism, might have had zero effect.
Quite possibly. The change was likely just statistical regression, but our minds desperately want a causal story. Kahneman stresses how hard this concept is to grasp intuitively. Even when you understand it, you often forget it. The takeaway: beware of inventing causal stories for random fluctuations around an average.
Okay, so we misinterpret randomness. What about how we understand the past? The narrative fallacy.
Ah yes, Nassim Taleb's term. It's our irresistible urge to create neat, tidy stories to explain past events, making them seem more predictable and understandable than they really were. We focus on skill, intentions, major events, and we massively downplay the role of luck, coincidence, and all the things that didn't happen but could have.
So we look back at Google's success and weave a story about genius and vision.
And we ignore the countless lucky breaks or contingent events that could easily have led to a different outcome. It makes the past seem deceptively simple and inevitable.
Which sounds like it leads straight into hindsight bias.
Exactly. The I knew it all along feeling. Once an event happens, we overestimate how likely we thought it was beforehand. Our memory of our prior beliefs gets distorted by knowing the outcome.
Like after a political upset, everyone claims they saw it coming.
Precisely. Or if a predicted disaster doesn't happen, people misremember thinking it was unlikely all along. It's a really robust bias. Makes it incredibly hard to learn properly from the past because we feel like we understood it better than we actually did at the time.
And this also fuels outcome bias, right?
Yeah.
Judging a decision based on whether it turned out well or badly.
Yes. We tend to blame decision makers for choices that looked reasonable at the time but had unlucky bad outcomes. And we give too little credit for successful decisions that, in hindsight, look obvious. That Duluth Bridge monitor case is chilling. People were asked if the city should have hired a monitor before a flood. Then another group was told the flood had happened and asked the same question.
And way more people said yes after they knew about the flood.
Twice as many, even though they were told to ignore the outcome. Knowing the bad outcome, the prior decisions seem negligent. The lesson is huge. Evaluate decisions based on the process and information available at the time, not just on the eventual result.
Okay, this connects to confidence too. The illusion of validity. Feeling sure about a judgment even when evidence says it's not accurate.
That's it. Kahneman shares his own humbling experience evaluating Israeli army candidates. He and his colleagues felt very confident in their predictions of who would succeed. But later analysis showed their predictions were basically useless, little better than random guesses. Yet the feeling of confidence persisted for each new prediction. It's like that Mueller-Lyer illusion. Again, the feeling is separate from the reality.
So our subjective confidence is just not a reliable guide to accuracy.
Often no, especially for complex predictions. And this fuels overconfidence, particularly in experts. Think about stock analysts. Very few consistently beat the market, yet they project confidence. Or doctors. One study found clinicians who were completely certain about a diagnosis were still wrong 40% of the time.
Wow, 40%. Why are we so overconfident?
Kahneman suggests it's because our confidence comes from the coherence of the story system one creates, not the actual quality or quantity of evidence supporting it. A simple, compelling story feels true and breeds confidence. Plus, there's social pressure. Clients want confident experts. Experts worry they'll lose business if they express appropriate doubt.
So is there any way to fight this institutionalized overconfidence, especially the optimism bias in planning?
Well, Gary Klein, who often debated Kahneman, came up with a brilliant, simple technique called the premortem.
Premortem, like before it dies.
Exactly. Before you launch a major project or make a big decision, you gather the team and say, okay, imagine it's a year from now. We went ahead with the plan and it was a complete disaster. A total failure. Spend the next 10 minutes writing a brief history of why it failed.
So you force people to think about potential downsides they might otherwise ignore.
Precisely. It legitimizes doubt and channels expertise into identifying risks rather than just reinforcing optimism. It's a really practical takeaway for anyone involved in planning. #Tag4V, the psychology of decision-making.
Okay, so our intuition and forecasting are riddled with potential issues. How do we actually make better decisions, especially predictive ones? Let's talk about simple formulas versus expert intuition.
This is fascinating work, pioneered by psychologist Paul Meehl back in the 1950s. He reviewed studies comparing clinical predictions by experts, psychologists, doctors, admissions officers, with predictions made by simple statistical formulas based on a few key variables.
And the result?
Overwhelmingly, the formulas won. They were consistently more accurate than the human experts, whether predicting student success, loan defaults, medical diagnoses, even the future price of wine.
More accurate than experienced professionals. Why?
Two main reasons. First, experts try to be clever, Kahneman says. They try to consider unique factors, think outside the box, which ironically often introduces errors and noise. Formulas just apply the same weights consistently. Second, humans are just inconsistent. Our judgments can be swayed by mood, recent events, cognitive ease. Formulas are always consistent.
Is there ever a time to trust the expert over the formula?
Meehl called it the broken leg rule. If you have truly unique, decisive information that the formula doesn't know about, like the formula predicts someone will go to the movies tonight, but you just saw them break their leg, then yes, override the formula.
But those cases are rare.
Very rare. And the success of simple formulas is profound. Think of the APGAR score for newborns.
Right, the quick check nurses do.
It's a simple algorithm based on 5 objective signs. It's standardized assessment and has saved countless lives by ensuring critical issues aren't missed due to subjective variation in judgment. The takeaway: whenever possible, rely on algorithms or checklists for repetitive prediction tasks. They generally outperform unaided human judgment.
But can we combine them somehow? Kahneman tried this in the Army.
Yes. He developed an interview system where they first gathered objective data on several specific traits, scored them independently, then allowed for a final, intuitive, close-your-eyes judgment. He found this structured approach, combining data with intuition at the very end, was significantly better than pure intuition alone. Still not perfect, but moderately useful. The insight: discipline your intuition. Gather objective data first, then apply judgment, and be modest about intuition's added value.
Okay, let's shift gears to the theory that really shook up economics, prospect theory. It started by challenging the old idea of expected utility theory.
Right. For centuries, the standard view, going back to Bernoulli, was that people make choices based on the expected psychological value, the utility of the final outcome, their total state of wealth.
Seems logical enough.
But it has a huge flaw, one hidden by what Kahneman calls theory-induced blindness. It couldn't explain simple observations. Like, imagine Anthony is rich, worth $4 million. Betty is poor, worth $1 million. They're offered the same gamble. 50% chance to end up with $4 million. 50% chance to end up with $1 million. Bernoulli's theory predicts they should feel the same about the gamble because the final states are the same. But intuitively, that seems wrong, right? Anthony is facing a potential loss, Betty a potential gain.
Yeah, their starting point matters hugely.
Exactly. Their reference point matters. Utility depends on changes from that reference point, not just the final state. But this simple fact was ignored for centuries because the theory was so entrenched. It's hard work for System 2 to question a dominant paradigm.
So prospect theory steps in. How does it define things differently?
Crucially, it defines outcomes as gains and losses relative to a reference point, which is usually your current situation, the status quo. And the absolute cornerstone finding is loss aversion. Simply put, losses hurt more than equivalent gains feel good.
Losing $100 feels worse than finding $100 feels good.
Significantly worse, maybe twice as much for many people. This asymmetry is incredibly powerful.
Where do we see this play out?
Everywhere. Kahneman tells the story of Professor R and his wine. He owned a bottle he wouldn't sell for less than $100 because selling felt like losing it. But he wouldn't buy a similar bottle for more than $35. Owning it changed its value to him due to loss aversion.
The endowment effect.
Yes. Or look at pro golfers. Data shows they putt more accurately when trying to save par, avoid a loss, a bogey, than when trying to make a birdie, achieve a gain. The motivation to avoid the loss is stronger.
Wow. What about negotiations?
Loss aversion makes compromise hard. Your concession feels like a loss to you, which looms large. but it's only a gain to the other side which feels less impactful. This asymmetry creates deadlocks.
And fairness judgments, like wages or prices.
A huge impact. People see a wage cut as an unfair loss, much more than they see foregoing a raise as unfair. Companies imposing surcharges, losses face more backlash than companies eliminating discounts, foregone gains. Even the law often treats restoring actual losses differently from compensating for foregone gains.
The actionable insight seems clear. Frame proposals to minimize the perception of loss for the other party.
Definitely. Frame things as gains or as avoiding larger losses.
Prospect theory also describes this fourfold pattern in how we handle probabilities, right? It's not straightforward.
Not at all. Our subjective decision weights, how much importance we give to potential outcomes, don't map directly onto objective probabilities. First, we tend to overweight very small probabilities. This is the possibility effect.
Like buying lottery tickets.
Exactly. The tiny chance of winning a huge prize is psychologically overweighted. We're drawn to the mere possibility, ignoring the near certainty of losing.
Okay, so we overweight long shots. What else?
We underweight outcomes that are almost certain but not completely certain. This is the certainty effect. We value complete certainty disproportionately highly.
Like paying a premium for insurance, to eliminate that small risk entirely.
Yes. We're willing to pay more than the strict expected value to achieve the certainty of avoiding a loss.
So this leads to different risk attitudes.
Yeah, it does. When dealing with gains, we tend to be risk-averse if the probability is high. We prefer a sure gain over a gamble with slightly higher expected value. But we become risk-seeking for gains if the probability is very low. Lottery. When dealing with losses, it flips. We're risk-seeking if the probability of loss is high. We'd rather gamble to avoid a sure loss, but we become risk-averse for losses if the probability is very low. Insurance.
It's complex. How does it play out in, say, lawsuits?
Think about it. A plaintiff with a strong case, high probability gain, is likely risk-averse and willing to settle for less than the full expected value to get a sure thing. But a defendant facing a likely loss, high probability loss, is often risk-seeking and might prefer to gamble at trial rather than accept a certain large settlement. This asymmetry drives settlement dynamics.
Fascinating. And you mentioned terrorism earlier. How does this connect?
Terrorism exploits the possibility, effect, and availability. The images are vivid, highly available. This makes the possibility of harm feel much larger psychologically than its tiny statistical probability warrants. System 1's fear response gets triggered by the vivid possibility, even if System 2 knows the actual risk is minuscule for any given individual.
Okay, one more crucial element, framing. How the same choices described can change the decision.
Dramatically. Because System 1 isn't neutral about words, emotional connotations matter. Logically equivalent descriptions can trigger completely different responses.
The Asian disease problem is a classic example, right?
Perfect illustration. People are told about a disease expected to kill 600 people. Option A saves 200 lives. Option B, 13 probability, 600 saved. 23 probability, no one's saved. Most choose A, the sure thing, risk-averse for gains.
Okay, but then the framing changes.
Yes, same scenario, but now, option C, 400 people will die. Option D, 13 probability, nobody dies. 23 probability, 600 die. Now, most people choose D, the gamble. They become risk-seeking to avoid the sure loss framed in terms of deaths.
Even though option A and C are identical outcomes, and B and D are identical, just changing saves to dies flips the preference.
Completely flips it. And it's not just students. Doctors show the same framing effect. They're more likely to recommend surgery if it's framed as 90% survival rate versus 10% mortality rate.
Wow. So the presentation is everything.
It has a huge impact. Think about fuel efficiency. Miles per gallon is standard in the US, but it's a poor frame for making decisions about saving fuel. Switching from 10 to 20 mpg saves far more gas than switching from 30 to 40 mpg, but the mpg frame makes them look similar. Gallons per mile would be much clearer, but it's not used.
And organ donation rates, that's framing too.
It's the power of the default. Countries where the default is opt-out, you're a donor unless you object, have vastly higher donation rates than opt-in countries, where you have to actively sign up. The default acts as a powerful frame, a recommendation from policymakers.
It's almost disturbing how much the description matters, even for morality.
It is. Kahneman gives examples showing our moral feelings often attached to the frame, the way something is described, rather than the objective reality. Whether a tax policy seems fair can depend entirely on what's presented as the default or baseline. System 1 reacts to the description, not the substance.
Okay, finally, Kahneman introduces this fascinating distinction between two different ways we evaluate our lives: the experiencing self versus the remembering self.
Yes. The experiencing self is the one living life moment by moment. It answers the question, does it hurt now? It's about the actual quality of experience in real time. The remembering self is, well, it's the storyteller. It answers the question, how was it overall? It maintains the narrative of our life. And crucially, these two selves often disagree.
How do we know they disagree? That cold water experiment is pretty stark.
It really is. People put their hand in painfully cold water for, say, 60 seconds. Then they did another trial, same 60 seconds of pain plus an extra 30 seconds where the water was slightly less cold, but still unpleasant.
So the second trial had more total pain, just a slightly less awful ending.
Exactly. But when asked which trial they'd prefer to repeat, a significant majority chose the longer one with more total pain.
Why on earth would they do that?
Because their remembering self evaluated the experiences based on two things: the peak intensity of the pain and how it felt at the end. This is the peak end rule. And critically, the remembering self almost completely ignores the duration of the experience. This is duration neglect. The longer trial had a better ending, less pain than the peak, so the remembering self preferred its memory, even though the experiencing self suffered more overall.
So our memory plays tricks, focusing on snapshots rather than the whole duration.
Pretty much. We see it with colonoscopies, too. Patients rated longer procedures as less unpleasant overall if the final moments were less uncomfortable, again showing duration neglect and the peak end rule. Kahneman applies this to how we think about life stories, too. When evaluating Jen's life in a study, people judged its overall quality based on significant moments and the ending, largely ignoring how long she lived happily. A story, he says, is about memorable moments, not just time passing.
So how does this play out with something like happiness and money?
It creates a really nuanced picture. For the experiencing self, being poor definitely causes misery. But beyond a certain income threshold, maybe around $75,000 a year in the U.S. studies, Kahneman cites more money doesn't seem to buy significantly more day-to-day positive experience. Rich people aren't necessarily experiencing more happiness moment to moment than middle-class people.
Okay, so experience well-being plateaus.
Largely, yes. Though severe poverty absolutely makes everyday life worse and amplifies other problems like illness or divorce.
But what about the remembering self? How satisfied people say they are with their lives overall?
That's different. Life satisfaction, the judgment the remembering self makes, does keep going up with income, well beyond where experienced well-being levels off.
So richer people report being more satisfied with their lives, even if they aren't necessarily feeling happier day to day.
Exactly. It seems the remembering self values the status and possibilities that come with higher income when constructing the story of a good life. It's evaluating something different from moment-to-moment feeling.
Why the disconnect? Is it that focusing illusion again?
That seems to be a big part of it. When you ask someone, how happy are you with your life overall? It's a hard question. System 1 often substitutes an easier one, focusing on whatever aspect of life is currently prominent in their mind. Like, ask students about their dating life first, then ask about their overall happiness, and suddenly dating satisfaction looms large and influences the happiness rating. Or finding a dime on a copier temporarily boosts reported life satisfaction.
It's that WYSID thing. Again, whatever you're focusing on becomes all there is for that judgment, like the California climate study.
Perfect example. People living in California generally liked their climate. People in the Midwest generally didn't. But studies found no difference in their actual experienced well-being or overall life satisfaction.
But everyone thinks Californians must be happier.
Yes, because when you ask someone in Ohio to think about living in California, climate becomes the salient, easily available difference. They focus on that and assume it makes a bigger difference to overall happiness than it actually does. The focusing illusion.
And this applies to negative situations too, like paraplegics.
Right. Our intuition, focusing on the disability, assumes paraplegics must be unhappy most of the time. But studies tracking their actual moods find they adapt significantly. They spend a good portion of their time in a reasonably positive mood. Why? Because after the initial adaptation period, their condition isn't the constant focus of their attention. Life goes on, attention shifts to daily activities, work, relationships. Adaptation is largely about thinking less and less about the new reality.
So the takeaway is, we often overestimate the long-term impact of circumstances, good or bad, because we focus too much on the change itself and forget that attention eventually shifts elsewhere. #tag outro. Wow. Okay, so that's a whirlwind tour through Thinking Fast and Slow. We've seen how this automatic System 1 is constantly generating stories, making quick judgments, using shortcuts. It's really the secret author, as Kahneman says, of so many of our choices.
Absolutely. And System 2, our conscious reasoning self, while capable, is often lazy, easily distracted, and prone to just endorsing System 1's intuitive, sometimes biased suggestions.
Understanding this isn't about saying humans are irrational or stupid. It's more about recognizing these predictable, systematic ways our minds work. The old model of the perfectly rational agent in economics just doesn't capture the reality.
Exactly. Humans are not well described by the rational agent model, as Kahneman puts it. This work gives us a much richer, more accurate picture of human judgment and choice.
So for you listening, the final thought might be this. Knowing that your mind is built to create coherent stories, sometimes based on very little evidence, how might you approach big decisions differently? Could consciously using tools like a premortem or deliberately seeking out an outside view, looking at the statistics for similar situations, help you overcome intuitive overconfidence?
Yeah, think about how recognizing these mechanisms, anchoring, availability, framing, loss aversion, could help you spot potential flaws not just in your own thinking, but maybe understand why others seem so certain about things, even when the data might suggest otherwise. It's about bringing more System 2 scrutiny to the story System 1 so readily provides.